So a couple things that we first need to think about whenever we're developing an app is the different variations in Android devices. We have phones that need to be rotated like this, like this. We also have phones that are larger form factor. We have phones that are smaller form factor, which also correlates to a smaller or larger resolution. There's a lot of things that we need to think about, and I'll show you in the tool here in a little bit how you do some of that. Oh, one other thing, font scaling. This is one thing a lot of people don't think about. But there is a setting in Android where you can make your font larger. And if all your fonts in your app are using SP instead of DP, those fonts will also scale. So you need to make sure you're testing that. So work under the assumption that your font can be scaled without you even programming it to be that way. And later on, way later on, we'll talk more about some examples of that. Alright, so what are views and view groups? And I think this quote actually sums it up pretty well from page 123 in the book. Every item in a user interface is a subclass of the Android view class. So the important notes on that is Android.view.view. That's the exact class that I'm talking about, that the book is actually talking about. Some examples of that are buttons, text views, checkboxes, anything that you would see in any of the tools that the design layout actually has. So that's just some general things that have been specialized to make a button work or to make a text show up. Or maybe it's to make an image show up with an image view. So those all derive from view. A composite view is really that. It's just made up of multiple subviews, so multiple other views. The best example, the one the book gives, is a radio group, which has multiple radio buttons that can be contained in it. So now we're going to start jumping into the different types of layouts we can use. The first one, which, to be honest with you, I'm pretty excited about. I wouldn't consider myself an expert on this one yet. I'm getting there as I'm building more and more apps with it, as this one is fairly new. But it's also one of the reasons why I picked this book in particular, because it included a lot of stuff on constraint layouts, and in fact most of the examples actually include it. Which I feel, going forward, that's going to be the standard. Constraint layouts allow the positioning behavior of the views in a layout to be defined by simple constraint settings assigned to each child view. So I'll give you an example. So in the constraint view, I have done something along the lines of taking a button and saying I want the bottom of this button to be aligned to the bottom of this constraint view. So I'm constraining my bottom to the bottom, and I can then constrain my top to the top, and then my button would automatically scale to that size. So imagine that in a more complex state where you've got a bunch of elements that are with each other, each constrained in various different ways, right? So it's actually a pretty cool way that it can make things scale and move around without having to do different nesting, which actually I have built views in the past where I'm like, this is fantastic, it's got everything working, only to run that view and see it run really poorly because of the complications of actually rendering the hierarchy, which I will go into that a little bit more. It is backwards compatible, so if you build something, as long as you're building it with the appropriate Android 7 or later SDK, the app should run just fine on an older version of OS on an older phone. And like I mentioned a little bit before, it looks to be the new recommended way to do things. Time will tell if something new comes out. Time will also tell if people adopt it wholeheartedly. But I will tell you from one thing for sure, all of the generated things that Android Studio now provides now make them by default constraint layouts, which was actually kind of tricky because I was in the middle of developing an app when this update actually came out. So then when I go to create a new activity, all mine now were defaulted to constraint layouts versus the default before, which I believe was a linear layout or frame layout or one of those. I can't even remember now. Okay, so linear layout. This is probably the one that I can't really say that for sure, but this is probably one I've used a lot. I definitely use this one a lot. It's not even a probably. This one allows you to position child views in a single row and column depending on the orientation selected. So imagine you have a stack of 3 elements and you want them to be equally spaced. So, but they need to be, element 1's on top, element 2's at the bottom, element 3's below that. A linear layout with a vertical orientation, you can add element 1 to it, element 2, and element 3, and they'll automatically be positioned on top of each other. And the same thing for horizontal, where you can actually have those 3 elements positioned left and right. And the other cool thing that they don't mention in the book in that chapter is you can actually add weighting. So say, for example, you had that linear layout taking up your full screen and you wanted the top part to take up 10%, the bottom part to take up 60%, and the middle part to take up the remaining 30%. You can do that with some of the weighting that's there. And the other neat thing that is that you can nest this, like you can have one row that is a linear layout. So you can have a linear layout that's got multiple rows, and in each one of those you can have another linear layout to make the columns, and those columns can all be different. And you will find yourself probably needing that layout from time to time, and then it becomes pretty cool because then you can actually put that stuff into reusable code, which I'll show you later on. Table layouts is something that I haven't seen in a long time actually used. I really don't have a good concept on if this is better than using linear layouts for the same layout, the table layout. But basically in the book it says you arrange child elements into a grid formats of rows and columns. Typically I've seen it done more with linear layouts nested. This might be more efficient. I'm not 100% sure on that. But one thing to note is each row within a table is represented by a table row object. So frame layouts. The purpose of the frame layout is to pick a part on the screen. So imagine you've got a HUD on a video game, or you've got a section of the screen where you need to do something distinct and have its like own little section to do stuff in. That's what this is good for. I've used it for really neat screen effects in the past. So I'd have a frame layout that overlays everything, and then I could do a neat little wash, or I can do like neat little effects when animations are happening. So I've used it for full screen overlays quite a bit. It doesn't do positioning as well as some of the other layouts, but you can use gravity to make items move to the left, the right, bottom, center, stuff like that. Relative layout. The relative layout allows child views to be positioned relative to both each other and the containing layout view throughout the specification of alignments and margins in the child view. Pages 124 to 125 is where you can read more about that in this book. Personally, this is probably one of my favorites, and maybe Constraint layout will overtake that here shortly. But currently, like, this is probably, if I had to make something really fast and had no time to really stumble around something I didn't understand, relative layouts and linear layouts would be where I would go. But one thing to note is a lot of people make the mistake, and myself included, in ordering. So for example, if you are referencing something to position something relative to something else, it needs to have been defined earlier in the view hierarchy. Because the hierarchy is read down, and if it gets to something that's further down the list, it doesn't come back to resolve that, it resolves it at that point. So you'll get some errors during compile time. So the order of how things are structured in the hierarchy is important. It's also pretty ideal when you want to try to have a single layout work for landscape versus portrait. So as your phone flips from here to here, and you can't see that, but from here to here, you can actually have your elements position themselves relatively accurately. The absolute layout. This is one I've actually never used in production, but basically it allows child views to be positioned at very specific X and Y coordinates within the containing view. I would probably say that there's uses for this that I don't or haven't thought of right now. And maybe there's some programmatic things you can do where you grow the size of the absolute layout or shrink it. But typically, I've only ever used this in prototype quick and dirty examples where I needed to position something very specifically, and I was only caring about seeing if it worked on a single screen size. But ultimately, I would say, for the most part, you probably want to stay away from this one unless you have a real clear understanding of why you are going to implement this. The grid layout. This is another one where it's very similar to how I talked about with the rows and columns, but this is actually even cooler, in my opinion. Because if you're familiar with Bootstrap, it's very similar to the concept of how Bootstrap does it, where you can have something take over multiple columns or multiple rows, and it works surprisingly very well. So the way the book describes it is a grid layout instance is divided by invisible lines that form a grid containing rows and columns of cells. But the big point is that children in this example can cover multiple cells. And I'll say that, for some cases, this could be a really good way for you to lay out your pages, because you can get all of that stuff to grow and shrink. You can have things take a very set percentage of your screen based on the number of cells it's actually using. So the coordinator layout, so the way the book puts it, and they don't really talk about it too much, and I won't go into too much detail about this because it's probably a little too complicated, but it's important for you to know about it. But the coordinator layout is designed and specifically for coordinating the appearance and behavior of the app bar. So basically the header across the top of an application screen with other elements. So one very important note, that if you were to go through and say File, New Project, you create a new project, and along the path you created the basic activity template, if you open the main template file, you will see a coordinator layout in there and how to actually implement that. Alright, so the view hierarchy. So here, for example, this is an imaginary one. This is one that's actually kind of similar to something that I would actually make, but I probably wouldn't have used the table layout here. So it starts at the top. It reads the relative layout. It renders it. It goes to the left. It takes and processes that linear layout. And it goes and renders the button, and then it'll go over here and read the table layout, and then the table row, and the checkbox, and then the table row, and the checkbox. So it really does generate the tree as if it was reading it one at a time, which is why it is important when you're in a relative layout that the element that you are trying to set relative positioning to has already been rendered. Because by the time it gets to it, if it doesn't know about it, there will be an error. Alright, so now I'm going to jump right into Android Studio here, and we're going to look a little bit first at the coordinator layout. This is that coordinator layout basic activity example that I was giving you, and you can see right here that it actually did create the coordinator layout. So, but I think what we care about more in this situation is just really looking at some of the tools and things that we have to work with here. So let's open up Content Main when we start looking at it. So this one is actually using a constraint layout. And you can notice here that there are actually constraints actually positioning the text view right in the center. So you can see those actually being rendered over here on the right side here. All like really, really neat things in my opinion. Because you can click on this really quickly and drop a constraint. I can do it again, I can draw it in there. Or I could have come over to the left side and actually type that in. So just something to keep in mind as so you know if I were to remove that constraint, notice that it shifts over to the left. I add that constraint back because I want it shifted there, it goes back to center. That's a very simple example of how constraint layouts actually work. Let's take one a little bit more complicated than that. What I want to do actually is I'm going to go through the process of creating a relative layout inside of here that maybe contains a linear layout at the top and the bottom, and in each of those maybe we'll add a button in there. So let's just play around with a few of this things, and then I'm going to use the constraint layout to help constrain those together. And the reason I want to use a relative layout, I was hoping for autocomplete there. There we go. And I'm just going to make the width of it match the parent, and the height is going to be very specifically 100 dp, because I just want that to be a very fixed size. And then the one thing that I want to do is I want to make sure this is constrained to the top, which it's probably not going to let me drag that there. There we go. And then I'm going to need to constrain it to the left, and I'm going to constrain it to the right. And now we've got our relative layout. And if I were to hover over here, I can actually see that right there. Now the interesting thing about relative layouts that I'll show you, and one of the reasons that I really like them, is that I can position something very easily at any spot in the container. So let's make a text view, and we're going to actually make the width of this just wrap content, and we're going to make this wrap content. But in the text, we're going to actually make this say something like, this is a relative test, relative layout test. Okay. But notice how it puts it in the top left. Now say, for example, I actually want to position this somewhere completely different. In a relative layout, I can do that in a couple different ways. So I can do a align bottom to parent. Actually, no, I've got the wrong command there. Align parent bottom true. That's the one I was looking for. So now notice that it's actually put in the bottom left. Okay, now let's take an example here. Notice that I've got this above the hierarchy here, and I want to make another text view. And I'm going to make this wrap content, and this one wrap content. And instead of aligning this one to the bottom, I'm going to add an ID here, and we're going to name this as relative text test. And for this one, we're going to make this text test 2. Let's make that capital, just make that a little easier to read. But you know what? We want this to be sitting right above here, and then we want to actually add a little bit of space between there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I want to do in this case, I just want to say I want to do above here. So I would do layout above relative text test, and now I've got that position. But now say, for example, I want to add maybe just a little bit of padding on the bottom here, and we're going to make that 5 dp. So now we've got a little bit of space between those two. And there's also a layout below. So let's do another one here where we're going to add another. Let's just clean that up a little bit. Let's add a button, and we're going to make this. Let's make this the full width, but we'll make it wrap content, and then we'll put text in here that says button. All right. But what I really want this button to do is I want the button to be put directly below. This is a relative test. Actually, you know what? Let's do it this way instead. Let's actually take and put the button to the right of test 2. Which, you know, that might be a little bit interesting because I'll probably have to change the width a little bit. Let me make sure I've got the right one, which this might not be. So let's call this, let's just do it there. Here. I did it right to the right of this one instead because I don't have an ID here yet. So I just did layout to the right of, so now you can see that we've actually got an invisible line here where I've now aligned it to the right. And match parent in this case just tries to fill it as much as it possibly can. So the hierarchy is coming through. We're rendering our constraint layout, which is everything overall. We now put a sub view in there called a relative layout. We've got our text view, and our button all inside the relative layout. So now, let's say for example, I wanted to do something really simple here with a linear layout. And a linear layout, I'm just going to make this match parent. And what we're going to do with this linear layout is we're going to actually type in the constraints. So we are going to say constraint, and actually let me add an ID to this thing so I can reference it better without deleting everything that I just deleted there. Which apparently I have completely messed up here for a second. So let's see, we're going to get rid of this, we're going to clean that up, and I'll probably just cut all this stuff out of the video. because I don't need any of that. We're going to make this relative layout. And we've got that. We'll get rid of this. And it's really weird how all this stuff happened here. So let me just see if I can undo all this really fast. There we go. Alright. Yeah, that was really odd. Because it kept like re-changing. I'm not sure exactly what happened there. Anyway, so I've got my linear layout. And we're going to constrain. Let's constrain the top of this. So constrain top to bottom of, and we're going to call this, you know what, let me just use the relative text test. And it's not going to work because it's not a sibling of that relative layout. So let's go to, and that would actually be right, it's not a sibling of constraint layout. So Android ID, let's name this ID container 1, and then we're going to make this container 1. There. Okay, so ultimately though, I need to add some height to this so I can see what's happening here to make sure this is moving to the right position. Yeah, so here is our linear layout. I don't have a left constraint and I don't have a right constraint, so let me just add those real quick. So now I have them. And now inside my linear layout, so I've constrained this. So for example, let me just show you if I were to add a orientation on this. So orientation, I'm going to make this horizontal. Okay. So let's do like a couple text views in here. The text view, one interesting thing is I'm just going to make both of these wrap content, and then I'm going to add some text in here that says button or text 1, and then I'm going to copy and paste this a few times in the same linear layout. And you're going to see how it actually is positioning them left to right, which is actually pretty cool. So then we can do 2, 2, 2. Wow, I cannot count apparently. 3, 4, 5. 5, 6. Man, I'm one finger off. Okay, so we've added those in there, and now let's say for all of a sudden we want to move this entire thing down. Let me just show you, like for example, if I were to take and all of a sudden add a margin top, but it actually looks like I already have a margin top in here, which is set to 8 pixels. That's confusing. So left, right, so okay, there we go. For some reason, like it wants to auto do something. There's definitely some bug here with Android Studio that's kind of frustrating right now. But anyway, let's take and get rid of this, and we're going to take this and set this to 800. Actually, you can kind of see it with a smaller number. 800 will push it off the screen. So notice now that everything moved down with it. So you've now built this structure in such a way that if you needed to position it completely different, you can do that. So a couple other things I just want to point out real quick before we call this, because I know I've covered a lot already. Don't forget that you've got your text tab here, which is what you see me working in most of the time. Then you have your design tab. So the design tab gives you all of those elements we talked about earlier, where there were like checkbox and spinners and progress bars, and if you need an image button, an image view, or a video view, those all derive from view. And you can just drag and drop them in here. The different containers that you can use, when we talked about the radio group, the layouts that we talked about, and we talked about every one of those. So this is all like very helpful. If you're looking to figure out how to do something, this is a good place to start. I will say though, ultimately you're probably going to move into the text view as you get more and more comfortable with it. The final thing I want to talk about is this is this is actually pretty helpful to know that you can actually change the APIs you're referencing, but more importantly, the phone that you're referencing. Notice I'm on a Nexus 4 right now. Let's try a Nexus 9 and look what that looks like. And you can see what it looks like in that scenario, in this larger view. You can also go in and add a new device definition, where you can go through and create a virtual device of any size. So if you have a specific device you're looking for, you can do that. So really helpful when you're actually programming to be able to do that. So you can see like a Nexus 7, and you can see like a TV. This is what the TV would look like, and notice like all my constraints and everything are good there. For some reason, the constraint layout actually changed this to the layout width of 368, where I would rather this be match parent. So in that scenario, then that would grow. But there's definitely something weird going on because I kept having a couple glitches where it would actually toggle in and out. But ultimately, I'm sure they're going to fix that. They're amazing at keeping up with Android Studio. So I think that's going to wrap us up for today. I really, really hope this helps you guys, and let me know if you have any questions about it. Ultimately, just make sure you understand the major layouts, understand how things are rendered, and I wanted to give you a run through of just the basics of how to use some of that. Don't worry or fret about the details of that. I just wanted to get you to kind of see the overall picture. Alright guys, till next time, take care.